In this video I'm going to be demonstrating how to use a spline to procedurally generate the mesh inside the level. So this is my spline actor. If I move this point around, you can see that it will change the direction of the geometry, and I can stretch this out and compress it as well. And if I alt click, I can create a new spline section, so that way I can get this object to be shaped. And that's basically what a spline tool, spline mesh is. So let's start with a blank canvas. I'm just going to delete this object. And let's have a look at it in 3ds Max. So what I've done in 3ds Max is create basically a simple pipe section out of a cylinder. A couple of important things to note is the orientation of this geometry, which is the pipe is facing down the x-axis. If you build a cylinder by default in Max, it goes on the z-axis, and you don't want that. The other thing to note is that there are sections in this pipework, and that's unusual because we wouldn't normally put sections within the pipework. But remember, because this is on a spline, we want this to be able to bend, and therefore we need sections within it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to export this. So I'm going to go to export, export selected. I'm going to make sure that it's in the right place. And I'm going to call this add pipe 1 meter, because this section is 1 meter long. And I'm going to go into Unreal, and it's going to import. And there is my mesh. The UVs aren't good because I've had to stretch this out. I will fix the UVs later. Trust me, I will fix the UVs later. Okay, so what we need to do is we need an actor that will have a construction script component, and that construction script runs inside the level editor when you're editing a level, as opposed to other scripts which run when the game is actually running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my blueprint class. So if you right click in a blank area of the content panel, you'll come up with this menu, and I can go to blueprint class and click on it, and then it gives me a list of types of classes and a very comprehensive list of advanced classes. We don't need to worry about any of that. We're just going to have an actor, and basically an actor is an object in the world that has script or code attached to it. And I'm going to name this spline pipe test. You can call it whatever you like, as long as you remember what you call it. And if I double click on this, it will open it up, and you'll see that there's not much in here. There's this little indicator which basically is there to tell you that there's a component if you accidentally drag it into the scene. And what we need to add to this is a spline. So I'm going to add a component, and I'm going to search for spline. And I don't want the spline mesh, I want an actual spline. So I'm going to click spline, and I'm going to add for pipe. And I'm actually going to drag and drop this into the default, so that actually there's the only thing in this component is the spline itself. and I'm just going to compile that, make sure there aren't any errors. So that's fine. We now have a tiny little spline in our scene. What we really want to do is to get it to dynamically form the pipe around it. So I'm going to go to the construction script, and a construction script is something that runs while the editor is running, as opposed to something that runs while the game is actually running. And this allows you to build dynamic surfaces or have things dynamically happen inside the editor. So what I want to do is I want to get a reference to the spline. So I click and I drag this in and I drop it, and this is what we call a reference to the spline. This means that I can use functions that operate on the spline. And this is the construction script execution line. So this is the order in which it does things, and this is the operand, the reference operand on which it does those things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just drag off this execution line, and I'm going to type for loop. And this will find and search for me all the relevant functions that I can use, and the one I want is a for loop. So you can understand that dragging off this execution line gives you things that you can execute. On the other hand, if I drag off this reference, it will give me the things that this particular object can do. And in this case, because it's a spline, I can find out how many points are on the spline. So if I type points, I can get the number of spline points. So the number of spline points, and if I just show you the viewport, the minimum number of spline points is 2, one at the beginning and one at the end. So I definitely have 2 spline points. And then I have to ask myself, how many times do I want this to go round this loop? And the important thing to understand about coding that is very annoying is that traditionally coding starts at 0 when you're iterating through a series of numbers. So you don't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You actually go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you actually count the number of times I've said a number, it's actually 6. So if I use this loop and I just plug this value in, this loop will go round and it will go 0, 1, 2, because that's the number of spline points. There are 2 spline points, but those spline points are called spline point 0, spline point 1, and there is no spline point 2. So for this reason, we actually want this to only go around the once. So I'm going to have to do a subtraction, and I'm going to have to subtract 2. And if this seems very, very confusing, I don't blame you, but you're just going to have to trust me. So what is actually going to happen in this for loop is it's going to start at 0 and it's going to count to 0, which would be 1 step. And that is actually that 1 step. I want it to generate a piece of geometry that goes around this spline. Okay, and if I've got more pieces to this spline, so if I've got 3 points, it will do 2 steps. It will go from 0 to 1, which is 2 steps. It is rather confusing, but you just have to get used to it. Okay, so this will go through the number of points, and we need to then generate the actual mesh. So I'm going to drag from here, and I want a spline mesh component. So I'm going to type in spline mesh, and there is my add spline mesh component. So this function has a reference to a static mesh on this panel. And what this is asking for is, where do I get the static mesh from that I'm going to be using? And in this case, I'm going to search down and I'm going to find my 1 meter pipe section. And so that's the geometry that is going to be added. And the next thing I need to do is I need to say what's the forward axis on this component, because the orientation is important. And if you remember, in 3ds Max, I made sure that the pipe was laid down along the x-axis. And if you look at that component again in Unreal, so if I double click on this, if I look at it in the Unreal editor, you can see that this pipe is lying down the X component. So I want to set the forward axis, and the command for this is set forward axis. And that's all I need to do there. And if we compile this, we'll get an error that says target, because what you need to do is you need to connect these things up. It says, what is my forward axis? And if I plug this in, so as well as plugging in the execution script, I now need to plug in values into these points, so reference values. Now, in this particular case, the reference comes back from the previous function. So this function, if you remember, uses this mesh, and then it passes it out into this component. So now if I compile it, everything is good. So what this will do is it will generate a single component, but what we need to do is we need to get this component to orientate itself along the spline. And to do that, we need to set start and end points. So I'm going to drag again, and I'm going to set start end. So this looks fairly complicated. The first thing we need to do is address the target component, which again is a reference to the mesh. And then we need to get the start and end points, and this is both a position in space and a tangent, which basically a tangent is a direction. So I want to know where the point is, and I want to know where the point is going. I want to know where the end point is, and I want to know where the end point is going. So the start position and the start tangent I can get from the spline. So I'm just going to drag this spline component again. And I need a function that will get me the location of the spline. So get location spline point. So I'm not asking where is the spline, I'm asking where is one of the points on the spline. And so the question comes, well, which point am I referring to? Well, that is the index point. So the first point is point 0. This loop it will be on 0, and therefore point 0 is the start of the position here. And I also want to get the tangent. So if I drag this off and go get tangent at spline point. So I now have these two pieces of information. Again, I need to plug in my index. And these go into the respective start points. So now I have my start position and I have my start tangent. That's good. Now I need the end points. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control W, which is just like an automatic copy and paste simultaneously. I know what my spline is, So I'm going to connect my spline in. And then ultimately I need to know what is the index. Now the start is index 0, but the end is going to be one more than we're currently on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 1 to this. So I'm going to hit plus on the keyboard. I'm going to add, and it's already set to add 1. And I'm going to plug this in. And then I need to set up the end location goes to end position, and the end tangent goes into there. And I'm going to compile that, and everything compiled successfully. So in theory, I now have an actor. So I'm going to close this off. And if I drag and drop my actor into the scene, you can see that I have my pipe section. I can click on this end component. I can rotate it around. I can also move it around. And if I alt drag, I can create new pipe sections. These protruding lines are called the tangents, and I can actually move the tangent, which is the same as kind of rotating the point round. And each of the spline points has its own tangent that you can adjust by clicking and moving. So that is how you create a spline pipe. So the challenge is to think about this, is this useful for just pipes? What would happen if you put a wall section in instead of just this pipe piece? And how useful would this be? Okay, thank you for listening.